Hello everybody and welcome to another of my videos looking at the cause, course and consequences of the American Civil War. Today we're going to look at the big question of why did the Union win the American Civil War. If you've not seen them already, you can go back and get a kind of year-by-year account of the battles and what went on during the war as part of this series. Right, so some of the debates. So did the Union just win because it had more resources and more men? This is kind of a really old argument. It goes back to this idea that Union victory is inevitable. And if we look at it, and we look at some of the statistics and things like that, then yes, the Union was overwhelmingly bigger, but it did potentially have a much more difficult job. And there are some quite difficult or dangerous connotations with this argument, which is part of the narrative that the former Confederate states and people sympathetic to them have created since the war. We're going to talk about whether Lincoln and his leadership were key about bringing about Union victory. So Lincoln's gone down as one of America's greatest ever presidents. And is that justified? Does he, during the war, do such a good job to earn the praise that he is given? The other kind of person on the winning side who comes out with great credit is Grant, and he is seen as the kind of the military genius behind the Union victory. And again, so how much credit can Grant be given? And we're going to look at whether there are key turning points, or a key turning point which suddenly swings the balance of the war. And it's worth remembering that actually there's an awful lot of the fighting early on in the war, in particular, where the Confederacy are winning an awful lot of the battles. Now, also, there's another argument that comes out, which is it's not really that the Union won, it's that the Confederacy lost, and there was internal divisions, and there was poor leadership, and there was mistakes and missed opportunities, and all kinds of things like that cost the Confederacy the war. So these are a whole series of debates we're going to look at. So this first one, did the Union win just because it had more resources and more men? Well, some of the statistics show a really marked difference. The Union is much, much bigger. So we're looking at 22 million people against 9 million people in the Confederacy. And now if you think about, there's a large number of those people who were held in slavery in the Confederacy, then the gap in terms of population size is rather gigantic. We look at some of the stuff in terms of production. I've done these in ratios. So iron production is 15-1 in favour of the Union. Coal production is 38-1. Firearms production, which you think is going to be fairly significant, is 32-1. Factory production 14-1. Wheat production 4.2-1. The Union had more livestock. It had more corn. It had more ships. It had more railroads. It had more everything. And so this has led some people to look at it and go, well, that's just a complete mismatch. If you wouldn't put those two sides against each other in a fight, it's not a fair fight. Now, I don't actually fully convinced by that argument, and there's a couple of reasons why, which we'll look at in a minute. But as this goes through, it kind of goes and leads to the argument that the defeat of the Confederacy is kind of inevitable. Now, that is often used by people who are sympathetic to the Confederacy or defending the Confederacy, who try and stress they were facing impossible odds. They seek to kind of remove any blame from Confederate generals, Confederate leadership, and in particular the Southern people, and say, look, they're fighting against this large industrial force. They're defending their homes. There's nothing they could do about it, but they fought really bravely and with great honour for 4 years, and therefore should get lots of credit. And we see a degree of kind of Southern Confederate pride in that. Now, this view, and it starts emerging pretty much immediately at the end of the war, this really irritated a large number of Union people, in particular the Union generals, as it really kind of discredited the likes of Grant and Sherman, who'd gone, actually, that was just really hard. We just fought a really hard war. Now everyone's going, oh, it was a war you were always going to win, and there should be no big fuss made about it. And a lot of historians have attacked this idea of the inevitability myth, or this idea of the plucky Confederacy fighting against all odds in defence of their homes. So it is quite a tricky one. Now, if we look at some of the other kind of facts and statistics and some of the stuff about this, and some of the factors, the Confederacy did have some fairly major advantages. So it only had to defend or hold out until the Union kind of lost the will to fight. Attacking is far more difficult than defending, and a lot of the battles in the Civil War showed this. When you've got an attacking force that's attacking entrenched positions, earthworks, dug-in defences, then their casualty rate is going to be much, much higher. So if all the Confederacy did through the war was defend, then really this kind of being small a bit should really be counteracted. Then there isn't actually an issue with size as well. The Confederacy is huge. It's 2 million square kilometers. So this is a very hard kind of vast amount of land to both conquer and then keep control over for the Union. The Confederate soldiers are also fighting on their own land. They're fighting in areas that they know, where they know the geography of it. They know the woods, they know the hills, they know all the rivers, all of that kind of thing, and that also is going to give them a massive advantage. There are also a series of geographical barriers, and I looked at this in one of my earlier videos, which kind of look at there's a load of rivers that run west to east in between Washington and Richmond. So whilst that's not a very long distance, it's an incredibly difficult kind of journey to make, Washington to Richmond, because every so often you're going to come off another big river. You're going to have to go over the river. Whilst you pause and sort out going over the river, you're just going to get picked off by the opposition. Now, slavery also meant that the white Southern men were free to fight. So if you look at the statistics, the percentage of white men who fought in the South was much higher than in the North. And part of that was because they didn't have to worry about the work going on back home being done, because there was a slave population that were made to do that, and also the slave population was used in terms of the war effort, making war materials, digging trenches, building earthworks, things like that. The Southerners themselves, actually, and they do this all the way through the war, they say that they are better soldiers than the Union. So they talk about kind of farmers making better and field hands making better soldiers than factory workers. They talk about it. They grow up riding and shooting and things like that. So they were confident that one Confederate troop was worth 10 Yankees, as they called them. Well, if that's the case, then the overwhelming numbers argument doesn't really work. They weren't so it wasn't only the people in the states that seceded that fought for the Confederacy. There were thousands of pro-Confederates who joined from the other slave states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland that had stayed in the Union. And they had things of value that they could sell and export to get the money for war materials, because you've got cotton, tobacco, sugar. So you've got things that the rest of the world's going to want. Right. So you've got to make your own mind up on that. So was it inevitable? Were the odds stacked too much against the Confederacy? And if they weren't, then we're starting to look at positive things on the Union side. So we look at Lincoln. Now, is Lincoln the kind of the key figure in this? He goes into the war. He has very, very little leadership experience, either military or political. But he does prove to be a very effective war leader. He listened to advice, but was firm in his decisions. He's said to have been an absolutely brilliant man manager. He kind of dominated the people who were working under him without them feeling that they were being dominated and feeling that they were valued and their opinions were being taken into consideration. He does a really, really good job early in the war in terms of keeping the Upper South in the Union, or areas of the Upper South in the Union. So it takes firm action in Maryland. He respects sort of, because he does keep sending weapons in, Kentucky's neutrality. But then as soon as the Confederates attack it, he's there to dig in and save Kentucky from Confederate occupation. One of this is really controversial when we look at Lincoln in terms of emancipation, which we will be doing in a later video. I'll look at the 13th Amendment Emancipation Proclamation and whether Lincoln deserves all the credit he gets for that. Well, there's a key in this where Fremont actually issued an emancipation order in Missouri, and Lincoln essentially tells him to back down and to not carry it out. And that seems inconsistent with what we know what Lincoln's going to do later on. But it was important at the time at keeping Missouri and the other slave states in the Upper South that had stayed in the Union. He had a very capable cabinet, the likes of Seward, Stanton, who was in charge of war, Wells, who was in charge of the Navy, Chase, who was in charge of the Treasury. And he also worked well with Congress. So he, again, it goes into the man management skills and the delegation skills and working with others. He had to make several kind of really hard calls in terms of removing generals who failed to perform. McClellan is one that springs to mind, so is Burnside. And he promoted those who did well, the likes of Grant and Sherman. There is a bit more debate here, though. Really, it can be argued he acted far too slowly. There's a bit of swapping and changing. McClellan comes out and in a couple of times. And so there's also a number of his appointments to generals, which are to do with him maintaining the political balance in terms of the interest groups and the different states in the north, rather than just being on military ability. So he does come up with the winning team in the end, but you could argue that maybe it takes him a bit too long to get there. Lincoln does use degrees of martial law and suspension of habeas corpus and things like that, but the argument is by most historians that Lincoln is never particularly tyrannical and did support civil liberties as much as was possible given the circumstances. But again, there is debate on that. He also offers great inspiration at key moments, notably the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the inaugural address of 1864. So he is a brilliant public speaker, as Lincoln, there's no doubt about that, and he does inspire his people. And we can see this, for example, he inspires his soldiers because they return to vote in huge numbers in 64 and re-elect him. Right. So on the military side, our key figure we can see is Grant. Now, he is successful in the early stage of the war when fighting in the west, whilst the likes of McClellan are losing to Lee in the east. One of his most significant victories in the west is Vicksburg, that essentially, by tying up the Mississippi, divides the Confederacy in half. And then he's kind of moved into taking overall control of the army. Now, he is relentless in his pursuit of Lee and Lee's army, and is finally able to pin down Lee at Petersburg and then ultimately defeat Lee's army. And this is something that none of the other leaders managed to achieve. And Lee, of course, himself is held in really high regard as a military leader. It was under Grant's command that Sherman is burning his path of destruction through first Georgia and then South Carolina. And this really destroys Confederate morale. And that, again, Grant is often a figure of hate in the South. And in those Confederate states was lauded in the North. And part of that is he is seen, along with Sherman, as being responsible for this destruction. Now, very famously, Lincoln was said to have said of Grant, when there was cause of his resignation early on, "I cannot spare this man, he fights." And Grant definitely did that. Whether every decision he made and every tactic he used was right, I mean, there are enormous numbers of casualties in Grant's army. But one of the things he doesn't do is he doesn't kind of, as soon as he starts losing men, hold back, which is what a lot of the other Union generals did, and that is why ultimately he's able to pin Lee down. Grant does have his critics, and they tend to focus on things like his alleged alcoholism, his kind of rather scruffy dress and things like that, and kind of struggled with depression at times, and go, maybe this isn't the great military figure that others portray him as. And those who like Grant, who say he is responsible for victory, look at him and go, well, this is a man with all his flaws, but that kind of made him more real, and he was very real to his men, and he fought alongside them, and a great deal of respect. So Grant is another possible figure that you could look at in terms of reasons for Union victory. So was there a big turning point in the war, or a number of key turning points in the war? Well, Antietam can be seen as a turning point, particularly because it leads to the Emancipation Proclamation, and this it kind of reverses a series of Confederate victories, boosts the Union morale, and the Emancipation Proclamation kind of really prevents any chance that the Confederacy will gain kind of British or French support. And so we can see either the combination of those two as a turning point, or we can see one or other of those as a key turning point. Gettysburg is another battle which is often seen as a turning point because it kind of destroys Lee's invincibility myth. Pickett's charge is probably the biggest mistake of Lee's military career. It also cost Lee's army such an enormous number of men and ends their operation within the Union. That it really kind of, from that point onwards, the Confederacy is really on the back foot, whilst Lee's plan had been to push the Union onto the back foot. And Lincoln's Gettysburg Address obviously follows the victory at Gettysburg, and again, this is a moment of inspiration for the Union. Vicksburg, as I've already mentioned, this great victory under Grant is another turning point in terms of splitting the Confederacy in half and giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi, which enables them to move supplies and troops while stopping the same for the Confederacy. You could see Lincoln's promotion of Grant as the turning point. If you're on the previous debate, you were completely convinced that Grant was the answer. And you could say, well, actually, it's all in the mix until we get to the very late stages of the war. And it's only once Grant is able to pin Lee down at Petersburg, whilst at the same time Sherman is burning his way through Georgia, that we can, at that point, we see the Confederacy is being defeated and the war has turned round. Up until that point, it could have gone either way. Right. Now, another way that this can be looked at is well, it's not about the Union winning, it's about the Confederacy losing. So, yes, Lincoln was great, but in comparison, Davis was really poor. He made 16 cabinet appointments to the key 6 cabinet positions, including 6 secretaries of war in 4 years. Now, there is a counter-argument. There's a lot of people look at Davis and say, well, he did as much as anybody could have done. Yes, maybe he's not a brilliant leader, but he was fighting in a very difficult cause, in a very difficult position. He's also the president of a country which is born out of the belief in states' rights. So the idea that in a war it's going to operate really smoothly from central command is probably a bit far-fetched. We could look at the missed opportunities that the Confederacy has. So, and the mistakes that they make with the cotton embargo right at the beginning, a really big mistake. They should have been really doing everything they could to get on side with Britain and France. Could they have taken Washington after the first Battle of Bull Run, the first Manassas? Could they have stormed Washington at that point? Would that have made any difference? What would have happened if Lee hadn't lost his Order 191 whilst up in Maryland? And what would have happened if he hadn't ordered Pickett's charge? So there's a whole variety of things where you could look at a lot of what ifs, but what ifs are a very difficult thing to deal with in history. Now, you could argue more widely that the strategy used by the Confederacy was wrong. So should they have used more guerrilla tactics? And various military historians are divided on that. But most kind of say, well, I'm not sure what it would have achieved. Was Lee too attack-minded? And he's often criticised for that. So his offensive-defensive strategy, well, actually, would a defensive-defensive strategy have worked better? Could they have done more to get British support? And there's various moments where that seems to pass by. And then a really radical one, and I'm not sure what you'll think of this, was suggested, well, maybe what the Confederacy should have done was carried out emancipation themselves, and then this really would have taken the wind out of the Union's sails. And this might well have resulted in an independent Confederacy, but would it have actually worked with the reasons why the Confederates fought? Now, I believe that they were fighting to maintain slavery, so that one's always to me seems a slightly odd argument. Now, the other arguments are more critical of the Confederates. People, they talk about them being divided and issues like this, and almost a lack of will. So there's an old argument about it being a poor man's fight, a rich man's war, but a lot of the statistics suggest that isn't necessarily the case. But it's definitely an idea that's worth looking at. There is a bit of an argument. Some of the states were more interested in their own interest than that of the Confederacy as a whole, and therefore the Confederacy doesn't pull together and is a bit internally divided in that way, and that leads to defeat. And it's also this idea of defeatism amongst a civilian population, particularly later in the war when Sherman's setting everything on fire. And there's a lot of desertion and stuff linked to that, with Confederate women calling on their men to come home and things like that. Well, I'm not sure whether that causes defeat or whether it is just a symptom of them approaching defeat. So other things to think about. So you might just want to think about the two sides independently rather than just about why the war was won overall. So what was the greatest weakness of the Confederacy? What was the greatest strength of the Union? So think about it in a slightly different way rather than just who won and why. Do individuals have a significant impact on the performance of their side? So, for example, how big an impact does Lee have? How much bigger an impact does Davis has, and Grant and Lincoln and Sherman and others? And what impact did the war have on both the North and South? So one of the traditional views was that essentially the North thrives and the South suffers. But is that the case? Again, there's an idea that that comes out of kind of sympathetic history towards the Confederacy, and that maybe the losses and damage to the North are underplayed and those to the South are overplayed. But again, that is an area of historical debate and something worth having a look at. Right, so thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like and to subscribe. Please leave me any comments, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thank you very much.